and get started. Start with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for this time we have to come together and study of your word. Pray that you be with our brethren across the country today, Father, as we're all meeting together in different places, God, and just pray that our time here together might be edifying and honoring to you. Help us to clear our minds at this time so they might have open hearts and open minds to absorb what we have to learn through your word. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right, let's open up to Lamentations chapter 1. That's where we're going to spend our time as we are beginning our study of this book. Now again, as we're studying this book, we're operating under the assumption that it was Jeremiah that wrote this book, the 5 chapters that make it up. But here in chapter 1, he's still setting the stage for the things that are recorded, primarily concerning the destruction of Jerusalem and the personal pain he is feeling as a result of its destruction. So as we reach verses 7 through 14 of this chapter, we continue to see that portrait, as I'm calling it, of the destruction of Jerusalem. And what Jeremiah does in verses 7 through 14 is record some details about what happened to Jerusalem as a result of its destruction. Sorry, not 7 through 14, 7 through 11. I accidentally said 14, but 7 through 11. Verses 7 through 11, Jeremiah makes 3 points about what happened to Jerusalem following its destruction. The first point he makes in verse 7 of this chapter is that Jerusalem did not receive help when it fell. We're going to look some more at that. The second point Jeremiah makes in verses 8 and 9 of this chapter is that Jerusalem became unclean when it fell. And finally, in verses 10 and 11, the third point will be is that Jerusalem became despised when it fell. Now, after looking at these things, we'll again see that sometimes when we sin, some things can happen to us. But we'll start off by reading through these verses, and then we'll look at the points. Again, this is Lamentations chapter 1, beginning in verse 7. We'll read through verse 11. In the days of her affliction and homelessness, Jerusalem remembers all her precious things that were from the days of old, when her people fell into the hand of the adversary, and no one helped her. The adversaries saw her, they mocked at her ruin. Jerusalem sinned greatly, therefore she has become an unclean thing. All who honored her despise her because they have seen her nakedness. Even she herself groans and turns away. Her uncleanness was in her skirts. She did not consider her future. Therefore she has fallen astonishingly. She has no comforter. See, O Lord, my affliction, for the enemy has magnified himself. The adversary has stretched out his hand over all her precious things, for she has seen the nations enter her sanctuary, the ones whom you commanded that they should not enter into your congregation. All her people groan, seeking bread. They have given their precious things for food to restore their lives themselves. See, O Lord, and look, for I am despised. Okay, we'll pause there. Again, in verses 7 through 11, there are 3 points that seem to be put forth here about what happened to Jerusalem when it fell, in other words, when it was destroyed. First point there in verse 7, we're going to break it down. This point is introduced in the first 3 lines of this verse. What seems to be recalled here are the first of 3 memories that we find here in verse 7. The first one is that the people of Jerusalem had during what the text calls the days of her affliction. Now, everyone has the word remembers there in verse 7? Yes? Okay. According to verse 7, what are they remembering? Their precious things. Now, what's their current circumstance? They've lost everything. And at what period of time is this going on? What does the text say? During what days? And what's affliction? Hard times. What's that, Elaine? Okay, being attacked was definitely part of it, but that word affliction does have to do with hard times, as Dad put it, or just times of difficulties. And the text also uses the word homelessness. So we know what the circumstance of homelessness looks like. Somebody's without a home. And all this has happened because of the destruction of Jerusalem. But yes, the point being made here is that during this time, they're remembering the precious things they had. And the text uses this phraseology, the days of old. So the picture being painted here in these first three lines is that during the difficult times that they were facing, the people of Jerusalem were remembering what they once had. So having said this, in the next 2 lines of this verse, they're remembering something else. What happened? Still in verse 7. They fell into captivity. The New American Standard has they fell into the hands of the adversary, but yes, they fell into this captivity. Judah went off into Babylonian captivity initially. Now, did anyone help her? Nope. That's what the text says. No one helped her. So at this point in verse 7, Jeremiah is now turning his attention to the fact that in addition to remembering what they had in the past, they were also remembering what happened that led up to their current circumstance. They were captured by their enemies, and what made it even worse, no one came to help them. Now with that in mind, what is said here also recalls the thought of verse 2, where the text said, "She weeps bitterly in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. She has none to comfort her. Among all her lovers, all her friends have dealt treacherously with her." Now applying that here into verse 7, it's still that idea. Everybody turned their back on Jerusalem when it was destroyed at this point in time. Questions or comments up to this point? Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah, that also happened there in the text. Is just they basically made fun of them. That's what that word mocked has to do with. It's making fun of someone. Something bad happens to you, imagine, and somebody comes and makes fun of you because that bad thing happened. But all this, after its destruction, this is what Jerusalem was facing. So that's verse 7. Any other questions or comments? Okay. So putting all these things together, the point we should see from verse 7 about what happened to Jerusalem when it fell is that Jerusalem did not receive help when it fell. No one came to their aid. They were also remembering everything that they lost that was valuable to them. And as Elaine put it, to add insult to injury, people were making fun of them because of what happened to them. So that brings us to verses 8 and 9, the second point. And that's that Jerusalem became unclean when it fell. That point's established right there out the gate. The text begins with Jerusalem had sinned greatly and became an unclean thing. We'll pause at that point in verse 8 before looking at the rest. But can anyone remind me what the word unclean has to do with? Filthy? Okay. There was idol worship that led up to this. Sorry, I'm jumbling my words. And we saw a lot of that in Hosea. That was a big theme in Hosea, but that was also part of what led up to the destruction of Jerusalem. And the text says that not only that they sinned greatly. Huge amount of sin, not just a little bit. So as a result of this, they became an unclean thing. That is the idea of filthy, but also in a religious sense, it's the idea of impure. Right. Exactly. Right. Right. Exactly. And there's all kinds of evidence for that that shows, and in some cases, if they were unclean, they were banished from society altogether. So that's also involved with the idea of unclean, is it's being impure before God and therefore not being able to be in His presence. Now, still here in verse 8, what happened? Other than the sin, what else happened after, because of that sin, other than being unclean? Hey, everybody who honored her despised her, and why? What did they see? They have seen her nakedness. Exactly. That's the idea of nakedness. Now, this is an image that's being used to make a point. But to put this image in our minds a little bit more, when you're naked, part of your situation is you're completely exposed. There is nothing hidden. Everything about you is seen on your body. That's the image that's being used here. But the picture being painted is that the people of Jerusalem were exposed for who they really were. The result was, even though they were once honored by others, they're now despised because they've seen the full picture. But the thought doesn't stop there. What does Jerusalem do? They're at the end of verse 8. What does that mean? Groans and turns away. It's the idea of can't even look in the mirror. They're hiding. Now, continuing to use this nakedness idea, if you find yourself naked out in public, you're going to try to hide because you don't want people seeing you naked. But yes, they hid. And it's all because of this sin. Now, let me ask you a question. Where else do we see sin leading to hiding in the Old Testament? Adam and Eve. Same thing right here. Adam and Eve sinned. They tried to hide from God. The sin of God's people were exposed in Jerusalem. They tried to hide. Now, the text doesn't say they hid from God, but it's just using this image of nakedness that they were, at this point, ashamed because of what this all led to. So that's verse 8. Questions or comments on verse 8? Okay. Verse 9. Now, as we come to verse 9, one thing we also have noticed up to this point is that Jerusalem is being referred to in terms of her and she, that language. Personification is what it's called technically. Now, what does verse 9 tell us? It's continuing with this unclean idea. What does the text say? Was in her skirts. We'll talk about that here in a minute. But what did Jerusalem fail to do? Didn't think about their future. So part of the idea here is they were involved in this sin, probably knew it, but they didn't think about what that would lead to. And as a result, what happened? Okay, That's true, but what does the text say? Okay, their fall was terrible, they had no comforter. They didn't consider that this would happen as they were sinning. But yes, the first thing we're told here is that they had this uncleanness in her skirts. We have to deal with that idea. It was one thing that I was like, what's this her skirts about? Now, what's a skirt? It's a covering over the lower body. Same thing right here. But it's an image being used that this skirt was hiding the uncleanness. Nobody saw it. But this is what we think of as a skirt. But again, it's being used metaphorically, for lack of a better term. But because they were trying to hide it, the text says they didn't think about what was going to happen for trying to hide it. But what happened? The text says they fell, and its fall was terrible. The New American Standard says they fell astonishingly, or she has fallen astonishingly. They had no comfort. What else does the text say? Yeah, for the enemy has triumphed. Okay. What does that mean? Foe defeated. Okay. That's what triumph is you win. But before that, yes, Jeremiah puts this idea of, see, O Lord, my affliction. There's that affliction word again. He's beginning to describe his personal pain. And we'll see more of that later in the chapter in our studies next time. But part of the point he's making is all of this has led to the enemy gaining victory over God's people. They were stronger. Now, when people relied on God, we see this during Moses' time, God's people were stronger because God was on their side. But now all this sin has happened. God is no longer on their side. They're being defeated by their enemies. And this is causing Jeremiah great personal pain to see all this go on. But all of this is because they tried to hide their uncleanness under their skirts, the text says. Questions or comments on verse 9? Okay. Mhm. Yeah. Yep. That is the picture here. And all because they're continuing to engage in this sin. And we saw from Hosea, they were desensitized to it. And so the result, Jerusalem fell. Elaine, go ahead. Right. That's true. And that's what Jerusalem does. They brought this on themselves. This wasn't circumstances beyond their control. They knew the laws. They knew what was expected of them, but they didn't obey. And eventually became desensitized to what the law said. So, anything else on verse 9? Andrew? Mm-hmm. Maybe. I mean, some of that imagery might be there, but text doesn't use that language other than the unclean aspect. Right. Yeah. Anything else on verse 9? All right. So, putting all these things together, the point from verses 8 and 9 about what happened to Jerusalem is that it became unclean when it fell. It became unclean before God. Another result of that was that they were exposed for its sins. They attempted to hide. But even before this, Jerusalem had attempted to hide its uncleanness, but without considering what would happen to them. The result is that it fell greatly, and its enemies triumphed over it. So that brings us into verses 10 and 11. We're going to run into this despised idea again. But the point being, Jerusalem was despised when it fell. So this point, again, is introduced with Jeremiah, again, turning his attention to the enemies of Jerusalem in order to make a point about the enemies. Now, according to verse 10, what did the enemies do? Stretched out his hand over all their precious things. Now, we've already run into that idea. What are these precious things? All the things they've lost, everything that was valuable to them. We're going to talk about that here in just a minute, the temple aspect. But yes, the idea here is that the enemies took everything that was valuable to them. Now, with that in mind, what was the most valuable thing to the Jew in this verse? And what's the sanctuary? And what's another name for that? The temple. These people, the enemies, went into the temple. Now, according to the language of this verse, why was that such a horrible thing? What's that? No, go ahead. Okay. What does the text say? Why was this such a horrible thing? They were forbidden from being there, these nations. Another word for that, nations, that we can plug in there? Gentiles. What does the text say? What did God command about who could go in the temple? Hey, but what does the text say in those last couple lines? Okay, do you have the word commanded there, Elaine? They're at the end of verse 10? Okay. I was hoping everybody did, but yes, it says, the ones whom you commanded, they should not enter into your congregation. Now, when we think of a congregation, what comes to our mind? The people. Okay? Us, those who are part of the church, we're the congregation. But that language is used here that God commanded at some point that these nations, these Gentiles, should not be among Jews, not in terms of out there in public, but in the temple. That language is being used here to say that even though God commanded that, that still happened. Because these enemies came in, they went into the temple. That's where a lot of these precious things were located. They took it all. But what's causing Jeremiah pain is that he knew that God commanded that this should not be the case, but that command was broken because of what God's people were involved in. So with that in mind, the question we have to ask is, well, where did God command this? One possible passage in mind here is Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 3. In that verse, we read that God very literally commanded no foreigners were to be in the assembly of the Lord, is the language Deuteronomy uses. But at the destruction of Jerusalem, that command and every other command God gave concerning Gentiles was broken. Because Jerusalem's enemies entered in, even to the temple, and took everything that they considered valuable from the temple. And this is all because of that sin. God's people caused this because they chose to sin. Questions or comments on verse 10? All right, verse 11. What else happened there in verse 11? They're hungry. And what are they doing? Prices have skyrocketed. Exactly. There's that precious things language again. They're giving everything up just so they can eat. Text says, all her people groaned seeking bread. And just to eat, they were giving everything up. Everything they hold valuable. To restore their lives themselves. Again, this is that language just to survive. They're giving everything up. And then Jeremiah inserts a statement, again, about his pain. See, O Lord, and look, for I am despised. Now, what does that word despised mean? Hated. It's a very strong form of hate. Now, Jeremiah is identifying himself with his people that are going through this. They're hated. They're no longer honored. They're hated because they're in this condition. But not only hated, this word despised also comes from a Hebrew term that means to be looked down upon. You're looked at as being inferior. But all of this is a direct result of the destruction of Jerusalem, but more specifically a direct result of the sin. But after all that's happened, people are just fighting to survive under the circumstances. Questions or comments on verse 11? Okay. So putting all these things together, the point we should see from verses 10 and 11 about what happened to Jerusalem when it fell is that Jerusalem was despised when it fell. Jeremiah has shown that it was looked down upon after it fell, Jerusalem. One evidence that it was looked down upon was when it fell, that other nations came in and took what was valuable to them. Another evidence that Jerusalem was looked down upon when it fell is that in order to eat, they had to give up what was valuable to them, just in order to carry on their existence. These things and more evidence the fact that after its destruction, Jerusalem was looked down upon because it was at the mercy of these nations around them. So when we consider everything that we've studied in these verses about Jerusalem, the point we should be left with is that something happened to Jerusalem when it fell. It did not receive help, it became unclean, and it was despised when it fell. So again, we see that because of these verses, the application to us is that when we sin, certain things can happen to us. Now, in addition to what we've already studied, these verses remind us that what happened to Jerusalem after its fall was a direct result of its sins against God. Since that's true, these verses teach us that certain things can happen to us if we sin against God. We might find ourselves without help when we sin. We become unclean toward God when we sin, and we might lose out on relationships. We might become despised and looked down upon when we sin. Since that's the case, we must continue to guard against allowing sin to grab a hold of us so that these things and more do not happen. Any other questions or comments? All right. Jeremiah